All right, ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to The Black Tower Show. I'm your host, Nathan Ford. I'm joined by Jake Fox. Jim Mars. Jim Mars on the show. It's such a pleasure to have him. We're huge fans. He's been doing a lot of work lately. Jim Mars, award-winning journalist, has over 30 years' experience with many Texas newspapers. In 1999, he began teaching a course on UFOs, perhaps one of the first university-level UFO courses in the nation. Jim also investigated the U.S. Army's remote viewing program. We're actually going to have Courtney Brown on in a couple weeks, and its connection with the CIA, that whole program. It was publicly acknowledged by the CIA and then produced your book, Alien Agenda. In addition, Rule by Secrecy. His book has been termed an underground bestseller. Jim Mars, thank you so much for being on the show.
Nathan, it's my pleasure.
All right, let's get started here. Our Occulted History, your newest work that you got out there. Do the global elite conceal ancient aliens? I just want to ask you, let's unravel this story. Who are the global elite, and what's going on here? Jim Mars on the Black Tower Show.
Okay, well, first, let's get something straight. This book, Our Occulted History, don't be expecting to read anything about devil worship or witches or vampires or werewolves or anything. This is not used in the sense that we usually think of the occult. I use it in the astronomical sense. When the moon eclipses the sun, that's an occultation. It occults the sun, which simply means it hides it, it masks it. So what we're actually talking about here is our hidden history. And I go all the way back to the Big Bang and come forward. And what I've done here, Nathan, is kind of combine two subject matters that were heretofore not thought to be connected, and one of them being the thing that we're all kind of interested in and gets a lot of talk lately about the New World Order or the Illuminati or the globalists or the 1%, whatever you want to call them. It is the super wealthy of the world who apparently are trying to run the world through economic means. And the second topic is one that has gained in popularity in recent years, thanks probably to that History Channel's TV show, Ancient Aliens, or, ancient astronauts. And that's the idea that the Earth has been visited by non-humans in the past, and in fact that they may have been largely responsible for the emergence of modern man and of our civilizations, because whether you go to primitive cultures in Central, South America, China, the Middle East, particularly in the Fertile Crescent there, what used to be Mesopotamia, which is now the one place we can't go to very freely, which is Iraq, we find that they all said they gained knowledge of mathematics, law, communications, farming, all kinds of things from the sky gods, from people who came from the heavens and came down here and taught them things. So my working hypothesis was, do these people who are trying to control the world today, do they have any connection with these ancient astronauts? And the answer is yes. It's really amazing. At the turn of the 20th century, it was none other than John D. Rockefeller and the Rothschilds who went over to the Middle East and were buying up ancient Sumerian statuary and seals and their cuneiform tablets, and they put them in the basements of the museums around the world. And so they obviously had a big interest in all of this. We know from mainstream media that Saddam Hussein believed himself the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, which was simply a degraded form of the original Sumerian civilization. And we find that the Rothschilds believed themselves to be the descendants of the ancient Sumerian god king Nimrod. In fact, they even named one of their children Nimrod back in the 20s. So these people know about this stuff, and it doesn't really matter whether you want to believe in it or not. The fact is they do, and they pay attention to this. And what do these ancient tablets tell us. They tell us that the Anunnaki, which is translated as those who came down from the heavens, landed on the earth, that they created the world's first great civilization, which was in Sumer, there in Mesopotamia, and that it's been just one big evolutionary roll since that time.
Our guest on the Black Tower Show, Jim Marrs, we're talking about his book, Our Occulted History, Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? Very interesting point when you talk about the Rothschilds buying up all of this, the tablets and things. You can imagine how, in a sense, they may have been entranced by the power that they just had. The fact that they now are able to understand ancient civilizations and now control it for future people and actually begin to withhold that information from people. So we don't know about this. Can you go a little deeper into what is it that we don't know?
Well, excuse me, I've got bad allergies.
Oh, you're...
I'll tell you what, let me tell you the story of King Nebuchadnezzar then. And you'll find this in the Old Testament, by the way. So it's not like nobody has access to this. King Nebuchadnezzar, who was ruling Babylon, built himself a energy field. Now, it's been translated as a fiery furnace, but then keep in mind that the people who originally wrote the Bible and who have translated it and who have copied it diligently through the centuries had no concept of physics or energy fields or anything else, but it obviously was some sort of energy field because it says this fiery furnace, and it gives the dimensions of it. It was just kind of a structure made out of gold, and gold is a very highly conductive metal, and so he built this structure out of gold, and but the problem was, it created an energy field, but the problem was every time his people went in it, they died, okay, apparently like radiation poisoning or something. So he goes into Palestine and gets the three Hebrew priests, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, brings them to Babylon and says, I want you to make this thing work. Because he knew that in the past these Anunnaki had such science and such technology, and he wanted it for himself. Well, the three priests said, hey, you don't believe in our God, and you're not our king, and we're not going to work for you. And he said, okay, then we're going to throw you in there, and you're either going to make it work or you're going to die. Well, interestingly enough, right in the Bible, they don't just toss them in the structure. It says first they don their raiments, their cloaks and their hats. And then, well, wait a minute, who cares what they put on and what's that got to do with anything? Aha, because probably they were putting on radiation suits of some sort, something that would protect them. And sure enough, they put them in the structure. And Nebuchadnezzar, who didn't want to get anywhere near it, said, are the three of them in there? And his minion said, yes, O king. In fact, there's 4 people in there. What? 4 people put 3 in? Now there's 4? He said, well, who's the 4th one? And they said, it's a son of God. A son of God in the Old Testament? In the fiery furnace? Wait a minute. What are they talking about? And they never mentioned that again. Okay, but obviously this energy field was like a wormhole or a stargate or something, and opened up a line to some other dimension or some other world or something. And to show you that Nebuchadnezzar was obviously impressed with what had happened there is that the Bible tells us that he put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in charge of Babylon. They ran the whole deal. So I think we can see here evidence that there was this ancient technology of energy manipulation, and this is what everybody's been after. This is what the alchemists of the Middle Ages were after. They knew, because of ancient records, that there was a way of transmuting base metals into gold. They just didn't quite have the formula. They didn't quite know how to do it, but by golly, they were working on it. Now, that brings us up to our times and the invasion of Iraq. What was that all about? We now know that all the reasons we were given to invade Iraq, Saddam's building a nuclear bomb, he's going to blow us up in 6 weeks. He's got weapons of mass destruction. We got to get control over their oil. We got to bring them freedom and democracy. All of that is horse feathers. None of that's true. So why did we rush into Iraq? Well, the thing we did was contrary to military strategy, which is seize an objective, consolidate your winnings, run on to the next objective. We made a beeline for Baghdad. And what happened in Baghdad? They looted the Iraqi National Museum. And what was in there? Well, according to the mainstream media, in 1999, 2000, 2001, they were making amazing new discoveries in Iraq in the ancient Sumerian cities of Uruk and Ur, and these was being done by French and German archaeological teams. Now, that's really interesting to me because the two nations who were the most opposed to our invasion of Iraq were France and Germany. And not only had they made all of these fantastic discoveries, but they even believed that they had found the burial tomb of King Gilgamesh, the world's first recorded god king who went looking for his non-human parents. So all of that's going on, and it's very real. And they were after something, and Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who investigated the Iraqi National Museum break-in for General Tommy Franks, reported back and said that the basement, which of course is where they would have taken all the latest finds, was an inside job, and that they had keys to the vault. Some of the guards were suspiciously missing, and the key thing is they bypassed expensive-looking fakes and went right for the new stuff. And he said they haven't recovered hardly any of that. So apparently that may be what the whole invasion of Iraq was about, was for us surreptitiously to get our hands on this ancient energy manipulation technology.
Our guest on the Black Tower Show, Jim Marrs, talking about his latest work, Our Occulted History, Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? We're talking about ancient technology and then the suppression of that information to the public. It is about concealing it and controlling that information.
Right.
What do you say to... We've had people like Michael Cremo on the show, and he goes into evidence that humans had that technology. You know, even millions of years ago, we've had guns, perhaps computers, and you even mentioned, the power of creating a wormhole and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. How far back in human history does it go? How far back are we going? You know, it's very difficult when I talk to people about the idea that humans did have that technology millions of years ago, that is even a possibility. And what do you say to those people when they come to you and ask you those sort of things?
Well, first off, we have no way of knowing if it was actually humans. That's the whole point of the ancient astronaut theory, which is, yes, there were living beings on this planet hundreds of thousands of years ago that apparently had access to advanced technology. And apparently what happened is that there was a geophysical catastrophe or a war, or perhaps both combined, and it knocked this planet back to a primitive state. And this is why today, as advanced as we are in technology, we're just now beginning to understand and uncover some of this ancient past. We don't know for sure that it was all human, although it could have been. But, you know, when you start... Here, right now, the oldest writings we have are the Sumerian cuneiform tablets, and then the Vedas of the Hindus, and they go back about 7,000-8,000 years, okay? Most people have been taught that the Egyptian civilization was the first great civilization. That only goes back about 5,000 years. And yet, consider this, the geologist will tell you that because of the very obvious vertical water erosion on the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, that both of those structures set out under heavy rains for many, many years. And that's just a fact. I've been there. I've seen that for myself. That means that they sat there under all this rain and suffered all this erosion, and yet the same geologists will tell you that there has been no significant rainfall on the Giza Plateau for more than 10,000 years, which means the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, at least, were constructed and were there more than 10,000 years ago. Well, that, predates our knowledge of civilization, although there is evidence and bones, fossils, things have been found that indicate that humans were on the earth, a million years ago. So a million years, that's almost inconceivable to us. I mean, I've lived a pretty good lifetime here, and it's not anywhere near there. To me, 100 years is a long time, and we're talking million years. We don't know what happened back there, and I think the thing that you've alluded to, and it really bothers me, is that there seems to be a concerted effort to prevent us from knowing what happened that long ago and to provide us answers for some very basic questions like who are we, where did we come from, why are we here, and where are we going? And the way they do this is control over knowledge and information. Now, most people who've got their eyes open and their ears open and their minds open realize that our mass media is under very, very tight control. There's only about 5 corporations with interlocking ownerships and directorships that control everything we see and hear. And I'm not just talking about news, I'm talking about, satellite and TV and cable networks, books, magazines, billboards, you name it. They control it. 5 corporations. All right. So, but then what a lot of people don't realize is they also control knowledge through the universities, who are dependent upon the foundations for grants, for the government for grants. And what about the government? Well, we all know the Smithsonian Institution comes and gathers up all the information about archaeology and anthropology, and that's the reservoir of our great scientific knowledge. And yet what most people don't realize is that the Smithsonian Institute is a government institution, all right, taken over by the government back before the year 1900. And there's been all kinds of stories about giant fossils and giant bones and the Egyptian artifacts they found in the Grand Canyon, and it's all been taken up, hidden away by the Smithsonian Institution. And who controls that? The people who fund it and the people who control the government. And I'm not talking about the president or the vice president or those bought-off people in Congress. I'm talking about the moneyed people who control the government of the United States. And they also are the same ones who control the foundations, who give the grant money to the various departments at the universities. And this is how they keep control over the whole thing. I was going to go for a master's degree, so was my wife, and yet I realized right away that they didn't want to hear about any kind of real groundbreaking knowledge. They just wanted you to advance an inch or two past what was already known, and that's why I kind of gave up on that. And this happens all the time. You get to the chemistry departments, you get to the biology departments. They don't want you to break new ground. They want you to simply advance ever so slightly what is already known. And this is a way of curtailing our knowledge as to what actually is going on and what has happened in the past.
Our guest on the Black Tower Show, Jim Marrs, we're talking about... I want to switch gears a little bit here because I want to talk about... We're having Courtney Brown on the show in a couple weeks, and I just wanted to get... I wanted to pick your brain about some of the things that you learned about remote viewing and its connection with the CIA. So if you could tell us a little bit about that and start to unravel that story for us, that would be great. Okay.
Well, the bottom line on the remote viewing thing is that nobody much thought there was anything to it. Remote viewing, of course, is the psychic ability to perceive persons, places, and things at a distance without the use of your normal 5 senses. In other words, psychic ability. And, of course, there's still a good number of people who scoff at that and say that doesn't work. And, of course, back 20, 30 years ago, they really laughed at it. But about 1970, there was a very popular book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And some of the wiser heads in the Pentagon and at Langley says, well, we don't believe in this stuff, but by golly, if the communists are doing this, we got to do it too, because we can't let them get ahead of us in anything. And so they began to experiment with this psychic ability, particularly at Stanford Research Institute out in California. And by golly, they found out that it actually works. In fact, I would stick my neck out and say that I think there's a very good chance that the collapse of the Cold War came about because of remote viewing. The Russian counterpart was, they had remote viewers, but they called them extra sensors. And so they were sending their psychic spies out, and we were sending our psychic spies out. I call them spies, psychic spies. And all of the Cold War, which was based on secrecy, fell apart because we weren't sure exactly what the Russians had, and we certainly weren't sure of what their intentions were, other than, of course, what the politicians were hollering, that they were trying to conquer the world. And they weren't sure of what our intentions were or what exactly we had. Well, with the advent of psychic remote viewing, we knew exactly what they had, and they knew exactly what we had, and we had more than they did. So the Cold War just kind of collapsed. So as a result, they actually formed a unit in the U.S. Army under the Security Intelligence Command, and they had about 24 intelligence officers there, and it went through a series of code names: Guerrilla Flame, Star Wars, Stargate, and things like that. And these guys were tasked to go out and find, for example, they would be tasked to go and put their minds out there and find a high-flying, high-performance aircraft so that we maybe could see what the Russians or the Chinese were testing and find out what their latest weapon systems were. Wildly enough, when they go out there to find something floating around in the atmosphere, they quickly realized that, hey, these guys are not us. They're not the Russians. They're not the Chinese. In fact, as one remote viewer told me, he said those guys weren't from our neighborhood. So they encountered UFOs, and they encountered ETs. And it was really kind of wild because in talking to some of the former military remote viewers, I'd catch myself in a conversation where we were talking about aliens, space aliens, just as matter-of-factly as you and I would talk about the weather. So it was a wild deal. But that's what remote viewing is, and that's why almost every one of the military-trained remote viewers, starting in '95, I guess, when they kind of revealed that this was going on and tried to act like it wasn't any big deal, and we weren't getting much out of that, and we're going to just drop all that. Well, they'll tell you today there is no such unit in the military anymore, and technically that's true. But then they don't have to have a unit, because what they do now is they embed a remote viewer in a lot of various government agencies and military units, such as the Navy SEALs and the Army Rangers, and But then that only makes sense because what officer doesn't want to have somebody close at hand that might actually give him some idea of what's on the other side of the hill? So they have branched out, and now there are remote viewers all over the place. Courtney Brown is one of those who studied under the military-trained remote viewers, and then he has gone on through his Farsight Institute to train others. Almost all of the Army-trained remote viewers have now gone into the teaching business. They're now teaching remote viewing to a lot of people. And, of course, it's still kind of snickered at, but I guarantee you, having found out for myself, because I thought I would try it, and I didn't think it was any good, and then I found out that I had correctly remote viewed an office building that had not yet been built, and yet I drew a floor plan that turned out to be 100% accurate. So, yes, it does work.
I know that Courtney Brown and some of the research that he's doing over there is showing in the future a global coastal event that he was talking about. I don't know
Right, with craters and all kinds of stuff. Well, I'm sure Courtney would tell you the same. Will tell you the same thing. But let me caution right now: don't go sell your war bonds and dig a hole or whatever. Because the thing I learned in dealing with the remote viewing is that it's really interesting when they can go forward in time, they can go backward in time. When they go back in time, they can see things very clearly because it's already happened, so it's just there. As they go into the future, it gets more and more murky and hazy, and it's kind of hard to see what's really going to go on in the future. And that tells me that the future is not etched in stone, okay? It's not a set deal. So that means that by the decisions and the things that we're doing today, we are molding the future as it comes into being, which is good because that means that we can possibly avoid some of this gloom and doom that sometimes the remote viewers could see in the future. Now, trends are going to continue, but I think we can alter things by altering our behavior right now, and that's why I think it's really terribly important for us to understand how this works and understand our place in the cosmos so that we can begin to shape a little bit better future for us. I think also we find that the universe, keep in mind, is a seething, swirling energy field. And within that energy field is condensed energy that we call matter. And that's us and the world and the desk you're sitting behind and the chair you're sitting on. And, that chair is pretty heavy. Seems like it's really a solid object. In fact, if you crashed it over somebody's head, you'd probably knock them out. So, we think that's a really solid object. And yet we know from our science that that chair is just made up of atoms. And those atoms are about 98% empty space. So there's really nothing there. It's just our perception and the way the energy forms into matter. And so, in other words, energy manipulation is where it's at because that can manipulate the entire universal energy spectrum. And that's why... So I think
when you were talking about remote viewing, it made me think that we are able. I do believe in some kind of mass consciousness. I do believe that even with things like the internet, it does bring people together in the sense that we are kind of all thinking together in a sense, and we understand the state of the world more. And as we start to understand the state of what is actually happening in the world, and you start to see the corruption and people begin to wake up, then there is a mass consciousness of more and more people that want change. And I do believe remote viewing might not be looking into the future per se, in my mind, but it might be somebody who's very, very sensitive to what is going on right now. That person actually can start to see the trends of what's happening in a mass consciousness and be able to project rather accurately what might happen in the future. That's kind of how I see it.
I think you're absolutely right. But I think it goes even a little further than that because if you can see what's happening now, then you can follow the trends and you can see what's going to happen in the immediate future. And you can change it. For one thing, I think that, again, since we're talking about one huge energy field, I think there are different timelines, all right? Kind of like the grooves on an old 33 1/3 record. Okay, now we're only aware of where the needle is. That's the groove we're in, and we see that as our reality because this is what we perceive, and yet there are other grooves. So, in other words, there may be another groove, another timeline, another dimension, if you will, where, say, Hitler won World War II, and we're all in the United States of Nazi Germany or something. And there's another timeline where what Courtney Brown's remote viewers saw, where maybe an asteroid broke apart and savaged the Earth. But then maybe there's a timeline where everything's just hunky-dory and people start getting their act together, throw off the banksters and the 1% and are living happily in the future. We don't know, but we can start moving today to try to go to a better timeline.
Jim Marrs, our guest on the Black Tower Show. Let's talk about the $1 trillion conspiracy. As I was doing research for this interview, I saw a speech that you were giving in Australia, and you were starting to break down the inception of the Federal Reserve. And it's very, very fascinating because when you start to learn more and more about it, and I want our listeners to go out there and research these things, the inception of the Federal Reserve, how it came about, and its connection with Nazi Germany and the war. And me and Jake were talking earlier about how if you can control both sides of a conflict, if you can both fund the war, right? You're giving money for the war, and yet you're fighting the war at the same time. These bankers, these people at the very, very top, were able to control both sides of this conflict. Can we go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, that's how you control. You can't control everything if you only control one side. So the thing to do is control both sides, and excuse me. And then you can have a war and a Cold War and a arms race, constant tension, which only increases the control and the profit line. For example, we've just seen here in Cyprus where in order to try to bail out their faltering economy, they are confiscating people's savings accounts, right? And they're saying, okay, you can only get so much out. They've stopped the banks. Can you imagine what would happen just tomorrow if they declared a bank holiday, and that means you couldn't draw any money out of the bank, you couldn't put any money in the bank, you couldn't use an ATM, you couldn't use your credit card or your debit card. Hey, wouldn't we be up the creek? Wouldn't everybody be raising Cain? Well, this is what happened in Cyprus, and I'm telling you, this is a game plan this didn't just happen. There was a document that is now surfaced from last year where the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which supposedly guarantees our bank deposits and safety accounts, along with the Bank of England, and they were issued a report, and they were talking about doing the very thing that they're doing in Cyprus. And I think this is a test case, and if they get by with it, then pretty soon it's going to be happening in Europe, and pretty soon it'll be happening here in the United States. And this is nothing but just theft is all it is, okay? And it all began with Federal Reserve System. Actually, it goes, if you'll read my book, Our Cultural History, actually it goes back all the way back to year one, but they have been perfecting it all along. The creation of the Federal Reserve System, which is, by the way, is neither federal nor does it have any reserves, this was a conspiracy. In fact, some of the people who participated in creating the Federal Reserve called themselves conspirators. They met some wealthy banker types. First off, you go back to the late 1800s, and you find out that they were creating bank booms and bust and making the whole thing very unstable. And people got fearful, and they didn't know whether to put their money in the banks or take the money out of the banks. And they started crying out for some regulation and for some control so that they could feel like their deposits were safe. And so they introduced a bill that was going to give bankers control over the banking system. Well, everybody realized what that was and said, we don't want that. You know, the whole problem has been these bankers anyway. So a bunch of powerful banking people met on Jekyll Island, which was an island off the coast of Georgia. There was a hunting lodge for J.P. Morgan, and they met there about 1910, 11, and conspired. And they created another bill that was supposedly a banking reform bill, and yet it was created by the bankers themselves. And then, being pretty slick, a bunch of the big bankers went out and publicly decried and criticized the bill so that the public got the idea that they were against it. So they said, well, if the big bankers are against it, it must be good. So they rammed it on through Congress, and they got it passed on Christmas Eve, 1913, all right, when most of Congress was out of session, gone, and weren't even there to really pay attention to what was going on, kind of like the Patriot Act, kind of like Obamacare, you know. Who was it? Nancy Pelosi says, we got to pass it so we'll know what's in it. Yeah, what kind of insanity is that? But anyway, so they got it passed, and they created the Federal Reserve System. Now, the Federal Reserve System is 12-member banks headed by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York City, which pretty well sets the tone. They make the decisions, and then the other banks pretty well fall in line. And these banks, in turn, are owned by other banks, which in turn are owned by private citizens, many of which are not even American citizens. So it's totally a banker-owned deal. Now, the way it works is that through fractional banking, which means you only have to keep a fraction of your of the money in the bank, and you can loan out the rest to make money. Congress decides that we need to up the debt ceiling, so they authorize more debt. Say $100 million. So the Federal Reserve System, this private entity that's not truly government, then prints up $100,000 worth of currency, and of course uses a few $100 of paper and ink, and just creates this money out of nothing. It's debt. It's just debt is what it is. And then they put this $100,000 into circulation. And interestingly enough, then they turn around and charge the government interest on the $100 million that they created. What a racket! I know, it's amazing, and that's why that everyone knows that the biggest chunk of the budget each year goes to, quote, retire the national debt, which means pay interest to these bankers on all the money we borrowed. And by the way, this is what has turned us into a zombie nation, okay? They call banks that have made bad judgment calls in derivatives and in the housing market back to 2008 when it all started unraveling. And these banks that are in trouble and were broke, bankrupt, dead, but yet they were able to keep in business because of taxpayer money, the TARP money that the government paid out to try to bail them out. Okay, so they're dead, but they're still operating. So they were called zombie banks. That's the name they got. Well, we're a zombie nation because we now owe somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 trillion, and yet it's been estimated that every man, woman, and child in this country was to sell off every asset they've got. And I'm talking about your clothes, your TV, your home, your car, everything you've got. We couldn't come up with but about $9 or $10 trillion. So we're dead, we're broke, we're bankrupt, but we're still going through the motions. We're a zombie nation.
Well, we have all the weapons, so, I mean, if anybody says anything, then we'll just bomb you.
Exactly. You're going to keep taking our dollar because it's not backed by gold, silver, anything worth anything, but it's backed by atomic weapons.
What do you think? What do you think about our foreign policy? That Obama, the way he's handling things in North Korea, and
don't get me started. Don't get me started. Yeah, let's look at North Korea. Let's look at Kim Jong-un. Okay, here's this old twerp. You know, he hadn't had any military experience, and he's never run a business in his life, and he doesn't know anything. And yet now he's in charge of this country with this nuclear. Oh, wait a minute. We've done the same thing, haven't we, with Obama? Oh, never mind.
So, Jim, what do the space aliens have a place in our power structure? Do they have any sort of contact with these globalist families, such as the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers, or are they kind of limited to the military part of our power structure?
No, I'll tell you something. If anyone who's trying to figure out what's going on in the world today and trying to put the big picture together, if they have refused to acknowledge the ET presence and have refused to look at all of the evidence of UFO activity, all like that, then they'll never figure it out because they've thrown out a big piece of the puzzle. that is indeed part of the big picture. And yes, I think the conclusion I came to after deeply researching the connection between ancient astronauts, the more recent UFO issue, and these global elitists, or globalists as they call themselves, is that they are either using modern technology in an effort to contact these ancient aliens, or two, they are in contact with them and are being guided, if not controlled, by them, or they are the ancient ETs. And they are still here trying to manipulate world events and trying to control the human population.
So in your opinion, what sort of influence do they have in our society?
Well, tremendous influence, because they hold monopolies over all the basic materials of civilization. You can just about name anything you want to, whether it's as far as basic materials, basic steel, basic magnesium, all kinds of, just the basic materials. And you find out that that's all under very tight control, and under control of one or more of these corporations that are all tied to these globalists. So, in fact, I witnessed during my lifetime this pattern where, let's say, Nathan, you go out and start a business. Let's say you, some years ago, you got the bright idea to, hey, let's rent out DVDs, okay? And people can watch a movie in their own home, and then they can rent the DVD from me and then bring it back the next day, and I'm turning around, and for that, that 50-cent DVD, I can make several bucks every day by people renting it. And pretty soon you've got a whole string of stores like Blockbuster, and you're doing really good. Of course, that's old technology now, but you get the idea. And then pretty soon you got a whole chain, and it's quite successful. Well, the next thing you know, one of the big corporations comes along and says, oh, here, and they buy you up. Okay, that's how you get control over everything, because we're operating under the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so it's really pretty brilliant when you look at it, because, see, you took the effort and the risk of trying to build up a business, but then if it's not successful, then you take the knocks. But if it is successful, then they come along and buy it up and then make all the money.
Well, I mean,
isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I mean, the free market system, we talk about it on the show all the time. There's no morality. There's no sense of responsibility or fairness. That's just inherent in the way that the system operates. That's by definition what you said is true, that the big fish eats the small fish.
Exactly. Dog eat dog. But now, let me tell you something. It's not always been that way, or at least not 100%. For example, back in the late 1800s and through most of the 1900s, you had, well, back then they called them trust, but that's just another name for the corporations, for corporatism. But they were usually these huge trusts, these huge corporations were put together by individuals who probably came from a poor background and just worked hard, had luck, and built themselves into these huge corporations. And a lot of them had a rural background. They came up on a farm. And they knew, like the old farmers knew, that you can't just keep taking, that you have to give back a little bit, okay? You got to let the field lie fallow for one season so you get a bumper crop the next season. And they understood this cycle, and they understood that, and that's why a lot of the old robber barons, although they were rapacious in their business practices, they also would turn around and fund the arts and, fund the opera and fund the orchestras and help build up culture and things, and gave to charity and tried to keep the cities, towns in which they operated, kept going, because that you feed the goose that lays the golden egg. Today, I don't see that. Today, it's take. And if they can squeeze another dollar out of it, get that dollar and take it, okay? Which tells me that those people are not stupid. So they understand what I just said, but they understand that it's all fixing to fall down, so they're going to take it all out while they can.
Jim Mars, our guest on the Black Tower Show. You've been doing great work for many years. You have so much information out there. Jim Mars, go to jimmars.com, JIMMARRS.com, jimmars.com. Our guest on the Black Tower Show. So, if you could go back all the years, all the work that you've done, is there something that stands out when we're talking about top secret? We're talking about the power structure and the elite. If you just have to go to one thing that is the most fascinating thing, what would you say as far as the most fascinating level of corruption and weirdness that you've seen?
Well, Nathan, I think actually we've been talking about it for about the past hour or whatever, which is UFOs and extraterrestrials, because I'm old enough to go back when we were told there's no such thing. Okay, it just, that doesn't exist, and anybody says so must be a little bit cracked. And today it's a whole turnaround. The polls in the 1950s showed that virtually no one believed there was any life outside the Earth. Today it's quite the opposite. The vast majority of people today said, yeah, I believe there is life outside the Earth. Now that's quite a turnaround in public perception. So what's going on there? Well, I think we're in a conditioning process. We were told early on that UFOs don't exist, and if you keep maintaining you saw something, you probably need psychiatric treatment. All right, but then I found out in researching for my book Alien Agenda, this was a conscious program of government, all right, to include the military. Denial and ridicule. You didn't see anything. If you're saying you did, you need psychiatric help. And it was quite successful for a good number of years in keeping people quiet about this whole topic. The reason it fell apart was because that us not believing that there was anything out there did not stop them from coming and visiting. And it just kept coming. And then we had the advent of the camcorder, and now we've got cell phones that take videos and photographs, and you go up on any of the search engines, type in UFO images, and you could spend the next 6 months looking at pictures. So you don't hear anything anymore about they don't exist. We just don't talk about it much. And of course, and as far as the younger people go, they were brought up on Star Wars and Star Trek, and and you talk to them about aliens, they go, oh yeah, it's like, oh yeah, okay. And so we're in a conditioning process, and I venture to say it won't be too many more years before everybody is going to become acknowledged, and we'll just know it's there. Now, does that mean I believe that there's going to be what they call disclosure, and that some government official will get up and say, okay, they're here and we know about it? No, that ain't going to happen. The disclosure is going to be up to them. I mean, if you think about it, Nathan, all they got to do is come and hang a saucer over a city long enough for the news crews to get out there and get some unquestioned video of the thing hanging there in the air over the city, and the game's up. And we all know it's real, and we all know they're there. But I think they've held off doing that because they don't want to panic the population. For one thing, it's not any big deal because, again, if you read my book's Alien Agenda, Our Occulted History, and some of the others, it's obvious that these things have been coming here, visiting us, since time immemorial. They've been here all along. Now, if they wanted to come and attack us and blow up our cities and eat us or whatever, like in the movie Independence Day, they could have done that a long time ago. And so it doesn't make sense that they've been here all throughout the millennia, but they're going to wait until now when we have our own rockets and satellites and laser weapons and space platforms to try to attack us. I just don't think that's going to happen. That doesn't mean that they're our space brothers and they all want to do us well. There could be some species out there who would like to plunder this world and maybe try to rule, but I think they're held in check by other races out there, and I think that they have come to the understanding that it's not proper to intervene in the natural evolution of a species, and so I think they do have something akin to Star Trek's Prime Directive, which says, you just don't do that. But I think that they are conditioning us by letting us see them. In fact, we have had an example of that here on Earth. A few years back, down in South America, while they were clear-cutting some of the Amazon rainforest, they stumbled across a Stone Age tribe that had no contact with the outside world. Now, in the past, they would have rushed in with Bibles and clothes and said, here, put some clothes on, become a Christian, and, blah, blah, blah. Probably ended up giving them smallpox and God knows what else, like has happened to primitive people all around the world. But in this case, we were a little bit more advanced, and we were a little bit more sophisticated. So they cordoned off the area, not to keep them in, but to keep other people out, so that we didn't disturb them, and so that anthropologists could go in and study this Stone Age tribe to get a handle on how their culture lived and thrived. And so what did they do? Well, they would send in a team of anthropologists, and they would allow themselves to be seen on a distant mountain or hill, and they'd wave, keep their hands up and out so they could see that there wasn't anything in their hands. And then they'd move a little closer, and then after weeks and months, they'd come a little closer, and pretty soon they were across the clearing from them. And they conditioned them to the fact that they were there and didn't mean them any harm until they finally made contact. And I think the same thing is happening to us.
That's a scary thought, edging your way in there.
Uh-huh.
Well, Jim Mars, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We'd love to have you back on the show again.
Okay, just holler.
Great. Jim Mars, thank you. Take care now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.